If I believe that Jesus Christ actually physically rose from the dead, that it's not just a nice symbolic story about how spring comes after winter and the good somehow triumphs, if I actually believe he really did get up out of the grave physically and was seen, then as a believer in Jesus, then I can face death and say, it's going to be all right.
That was Reverend Tim Keller, founder of Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York, talking to me in 2021 after he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer the prior year, sounding an awful lot like my mom and dad. Reverend Keller died last Friday at the age of 72. And with us now for Faith on Fridays is the editor of NewYorker.com, Michael Luo. He oversees the magazine's online editorial operation. He also wrote a really moving article about Tim Keller for the magazine. Also with us, Russell Moore. He is the editor-in-chief at Christianity Today and leads its public theology project. He's also the author of the forthcoming book, Losing Our Religion, an altar call for evangelical America. And before we talk about that and get into some of the things that Tim had said about his concern about where the evangelical church was going, Michael, first, let's just talk about, just the remarkable things that he did in New York City. And of course, I didn't know it at the time, but we had gone to Redeemer at the same time for several years. And I think I told you, I was shocked. I missed services one day, showed up on Amsterdam and 72nd at 5:30 in the afternoon, got there 10 minutes early. There wasn't a seat in that huge church. It was an extraordinarily diverse crowd, and everybody in there was about 10 years younger than me. And I said, in New York City? This is amazing what this guy's done. Talk about it.
Yeah, Tim founded Redeemer in 1989, and it within 3 years it grew to 1,000 people, and at 9/11 was a pivotal moment for the church, and its attendance really shot up after that and stayed high. It was, I think, across all the different services, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000. Sometimes it's kind of hard to count exactly, but it was a remarkable place. And as you said, really diverse, a lot of young professionals, artists, bankers, lawyers, journalists. And I got to know Tim in 2006 when I wrote a story about him for the New York Times. And this was, at that point, he was well known among, I think the kind of Christian community, a certain kind of Christian community, evangelical sort of community, but didn't really have a national profile. I think that came actually fairly late in his life when he started writing books. And a New York Times best-selling book, his first book, Reason for God, number 6 on the New York Times bestseller list, and he just kept pumping them out. And that's when he really became, I think, a figure of much wider renown.
And Russell, the thing I noticed when I went to Redeemer on believe it or not, on Central Park West, right? And I think 64th, is you would think that somebody would think, well, if I'm going to be like preaching in Manhattan, this is not fertile ground for my message. So I'm going to kind of soft pedal this. No, he went right at him. He said, if you're here because you're probably too ambitious. Your job gets in the way of what you're doing as a husband or as a son or as a daughter or as a whatever. I mean, he went after people. He knew his audience. Instead of playing to him, he went straight at him, which reminded me of a call that you told me about that you had with him when he was literally in the hospital for his last time. And as he was dying, he was listening, wasn't talking, but he felt the need to interrupt you, to correct you, to straighten your theology out. Talk about that.
Well, he corrected my theology many times, but this was actually a friend of ours who said something, and Tim interrupted from his hospital bed to say, well, that's not the gospel, that's moralism, which was a big part of his message, of course, was that it's not about doing better and doing more and achieving, which was especially important in New York City. And it would have been really easy, as you mentioned, for Tim to be a hack in a couple of ways. He could have shaved off all of the hard edges of the truth and not respected his people intellectually. Or he could have treated New York as some sort of a scary place that he could raise money off of and go around the world and say, I'm in the belly of the beast. And he didn't do that either. He loved New York. He loved Jesus. He respected the people he talked to, and he did so with integrity and with patience. There was a New York City pastor who texted me the other day and said, Gandalf isn't supposed to die. And that's the way many of us feel. He was a Christian Gandalf, a sage, and had wisdom, and not just wisdom, but an example that's going to be missed.
Michael, obviously, Reverend Keller was one that surprised many of us in New York in ministry. What he did was phenomenal. Authenticity. I think that one of the things that you could observe from his ministry is people believed he was authentic. This wasn't a marketing scheme. This wasn't him going what was trending in religious circles at the time. Talk about that. You've studied him. You've written about him. Authenticity being a key part of his charisma.
Yeah, that's actually a really great point. This wasn't a strategy for him. I remember visiting his home in Roosevelt Island, him and Kathy, and what I remember about his apartment was the bookshelves. They're just overflowing with books, and what I would say that was actually crucial to his success was he was a reader. He just, his sermons, he cited everything from, this kind of standards of C.S. Lewis, J.R. Tolkien, but also Jane Jacobs, Charles Taylor, who's a philosopher, N.T. Wright, and he wasn't doing this from a kind of a strategic sort of point of view of how do I reach sort of people. But he was genuinely curious, and one of the defining, I think, features of his ministry was he was friends with a ton of really influential journalists, politicians, people, academics. I mentioned in my piece, everybody from Joe Scarborough, our very own Joe Scarborough, to Francis Collins, who was head of the NIH, to he was friendly with George Bush. He was friendly with Nick Kristof, David Brooks. And I think they were drawn to him because he had this kind of intellect and this curiosity. I think it was kind of some of his pastoral side of him. I got to know him as a journalist first, and then I started going to his church, and he really became a friend. And what I've been saying to people is, he was a good friend, as in, not necessarily because I think we were, I was in his inner circle or anything, but he listened. He remembered things in my life. He asked questions all the way to the very end. And that's what's emotional for me, thinking about that it's been a week since he passed away.
Here's Tim a decade ago, One Morning Joe, where he talked about the influence of faith in the workplace.
The problem is that when you make your work your identity, which of course is what we're invited to do in our culture now, especially with the professionals, when you make it your identity, you identify with your work, and that means if you're successful, it destroys you because it goes to your head. If you're not successful, it destroys you because it goes to your heart, and it destroys your self-worth. And what you need with faith is faith gives you an identity that's not in work or accomplishment, and that gives you insulation against the weather changes. So if you're successful, you stay humble. If you're not successful, you have some ballast. And so basically making your work, your identity, kind of an idol, to use biblical terminology, is maybe the big sin of New York City.
It is a foundation. And Russell, speaking of idols, it reminds me of something that we've all, well, I don't want to speak for Michael, I'll just speak for you and Tim and myself, let Michael speak for himself. But the idols that have been set up over the past 7, 8 years in the evangelical movement, and this is what, in Michael's piece, he says this. The meaning of the term evangelical changed radically, no longer describing a historic set of Christian doctrines. Evangelical used to denote people who claimed the high moral ground, Tim Keller wrote. Now in popular usage, the word is nearly synonymous with hypocrite. Keller sought to return to what he called little e evangelism, which is defined not by a political party, whether conservative, liberal, or populist, but by theological beliefs. And I know, Russell, you and I have talked about this, and some of my good friends have talked about this too often, where people identify, this has become an identifier, a political identifier, instead of a faith that, at least when we were growing up, being evangelical was a response to the Pentecostals who put walls up against the world and said, we're just going to hunker down here and keep the world outside of us. That's what Tim was talking about. You're supposed to be separate from the world, but open and forward-facing to the world and accepting and forgiving, not only of ourselves, understood all too well and what we've lost.
Well, he did understand it, and you can even see that in his dying days. He really did believe that Jesus Christ was raised from the dead, and that gave him a confidence. I remember I had him as a guest with me when I was teaching a class out at the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago, in which almost all of the students were completely secular, skeptical to religion, and one of them said to Tim, why do you want to use the word evangelical when it's such a politicized and hypocritical word right now? And Tim said, because most of us are in Africa and Asia and Latin America, and the North Americans don't get to choose our name just because we've messed it up. And the student just said, fair enough, and sat down.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. I greatly appreciate you coming here, Russell and Michael. And just to remember, Tim, it means so much. And by the way, Michael, I feel like I need to, my son just sent this to me. I told him you were a big Liverpool fan. I have to read this. Did you see Salah's tweet yesterday?
I did.
I'm totally devastated. There's absolutely no excuse for this. We had everything we needed to make it to next year's Champions League, and we failed. We are Liverpool, and qualifying to the competition is the bare minimum. I am sorry. It is too soon for an uplifting or optimistic statement. That's kind of how we all feel, isn't it, Michael?
Oh, I mean, we care. I mean, Mo Salah, he cares, and the squad let us down this year, but we'll be back.
We will be back. All right, thank you guys both. Greatly appreciate it. And the third hour of Morning Joe continues right now with this.